The Hiroshima disaster. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. Dawn of the atomic age. 400,000 inhabitants is annihilated in a few seconds. A new chapter of history begins. The physical impact of the atom bomb was beyond belief, beyond all apprehension, beyond imagination. Its psychological impact was appalling. The Japanese military authorities were incapable of suppressing the news. In a few hours, a few days, the survivors told the whole country the incredible story of an incandescent bomb dropped by the Americans and devouring everything in its path. 3 days later, on August 9th, it was Nagasaki's turn to experience the devastating force of this new weapon, and the Japanese scientists discovered what it really was. The emperor summoned the country's military leaders and told them that surrender was inevitable. Then came the report that the Russians had attacked Manchuria. On August 9th at dawn, 8 days before the date agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference. This was another unexpected blow, but its psychological impact was far less than that of the reduction of 2 Japanese cities to radioactive rubble. However, those who held power in Japan before August 6 knew that 14 years of war with China and 3.5 years of fighting throughout the Pacific against the United States, Great Britain, and Australia had left Japan in an extremely vulnerable position. 3/4 of its naval forces were destroyed, and its air force was greatly diminished. The last kamikazes, suicide pilots, were flying obsolete aircraft. Its industrial cities had been razed to the ground, and this meant that its war production was incapable of replacing the equipment lost or even of producing the essential supplies to carry on the war. The streets of Tokyo were heaped with radiators and water pipes, removed from buildings on war ministry orders to mitigate the shortage of iron. Food rations were drastically reduced. It was impossible to find a needle or a reel of cotton in the shops. A broken glass could not be replaced. According to Japanese official figures, Allied bombing raids had already destroyed or seriously damaged 81 of Japan's major cities. In Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe, 4/5 of the buildings had been destroyed by fire. There were 280,000 civilian dead and 420,000 injured. 2 million houses had been bombed or burned down, and 9 million civilians were homeless and attempting to get away to relatives in the countryside. The situation was grave, and Japan's resistance was seriously undermined, especially as the Americans had just established bases on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, dangerously near the home islands. In spite of that, orders to the soldiers were to resist to the last man to save the emperor and the flag. Those who were in Japan at the time knew that a Japanese military victory would probably mean death for all white people found in the territories they were occupying, prisoners, enemy or neutral civilians, and thousands of Allied soldiers would be killed in conquering metropolitan Japan. Some diplomatic missions in Japan were so sure that this would happen that they had armed their staff for such an event. However, the sudden, almost supernatural apparition of the atom bomb over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki abruptly changed the course of history. The emperor, still a god in those days, immediately regained his mystical powers and used them to impose unconditional surrender on his generals. In so doing, he handed over to the enemy vast territories extending from Singapore to the Kuriles and from the Russian-Manchurian border to Borneo. Furthermore, he gave the order for 4 million well-equipped soldiers, the great majority of whom had done no fighting, to lay down their arms. This shows the extraordinary power this man had over his people, an impression heightened by the perfectly calm and disciplined manner in which the surrender was made. It seems that the capitulation was successful for 2 reasons. Firstly, General MacArthur agreed to respect the emperor's rank, and secondly, he decided to repatriate all the Japanese outside metropolitan Japan without taking any prisoners. Indeed, to keep the emperor at the head of the state was the only way to avoid anarchy. Furthermore, repatriating the army and allowing all the soldiers from metropolitan Japan to return home spared them the humiliation of captivity, which they would never have accepted without a fight to the finish, in spite of the emperor's orders for a cease-fire at the scene of nuclear devastation. How I came to witness the aftermath of the first atom bomb. After leaving Geneva in June 1945 to take up my new post as head of the ICRC delegation in Japan, I arrived in Manchuria on July 28th, having traveled for thousands of miles: Paris, Naples, Athens, Cairo, Tehran, Moscow, Siberia, Chita, Otpor, Manchuria. On August 6, 1945, with no inkling of the tragic events taking place in Hiroshima, I visited the Allied high-ranking prisoners of war held by the Japanese near Seppinghai, Manchuria, and including Generals Wainwright and Percival, of whom we had heard nothing for more than 2 years. On August 9, 1945, several hours after the Russians entered the war against Japan and their planes invaded Manchurian airspace, and on the very day that the Americans dropped the second atom bomb on Nagasaki, I left in a Japanese military plane at 11:30 a.m. during an alert from the airfield at Sinking, today Changchun, capital of Manchuria. Any encounter with an enemy plane would have been fatal, but luck was on my side, and I landed safely the same day at Tokyo. My Swiss friends were waiting there for me. A bus took us from the airfield to the heart of Tokyo. In the dusk, I could just make out streets. On all sides, sections of broken walls, electric wires hanging down pathetically in heaps of rusty scrap iron. Further away, amidst acres of cold ashes, I could see small stone houses here and there, with almost no windows, still standing miraculously intact. I asked what they were. Was the reply. This is obviously your first visit to Japan, and you don't know. These minute structures of concrete or robust masonry were built by the Japanese after the earthquake in 1923. At that time, Tokyo and Yokohama were completely destroyed, burned to the ground by this natural disaster. The Japanese noticed that only a few stone houses escaped the ensuing fire. When Tokyo was being rebuilt, the wealthiest inhabitants were able to indulge in these structures, in which they placed their most valuable possessions. Poorer members of the community had to make do with an ordinary safe in their homes. Indeed, as I looked closer, I could see hundreds of these safes stick, up intact in the fields of rubble. We arrived at our friend's home after dark. They were lucky to have found accommodation in a house that had escaped the bombing. They looked at me as if I were a ghost. They had been out of touch with Switzerland for 4 years. Only the radio, listened to in secret, had informed them of the main news. Their first question was, "What are they saying about the atom bomb in Europe?" They forgot that I had left Switzerland 2 months before, and that for 15 days I had been among the Japanese, who were as silent as the grave. It was my turn to be astonished and to ask questions. For the first time I heard the name of Hiroshima, the words atom bomb. Some said that there were possibly 100,000 dead. Others retorted 50,000. The bomb was said to have been dropped by parachute. The victims had been burnt to death by rays, etc. A Japanese working with our delegation, who heard what was being rumored on all sides, confirmed the news. The people were stunned, demoralized. The stations were teeming with crowds, as everyone was, leaving the cities. But there was no confusion, because the Japanese were naturally disciplined. Furthermore, typhoons and earthquakes had made them used to controlling their fear. Nevertheless, the situation remained serious. The next day, I met the Swedish diplomats. We all had the same idea. With this new weapon and the fact that the Russians had entered, the conflict put an end to the war. During the next few days, events moved fast and our feelings proved correct. The general staff were summoned to the imperial palace. Rumors of an armistice were heard everywhere. Finally, on August 15th, the emperor spoke to his people on the radio. for the first time in the history of Japan. He asked them to accept the conditions of the Potsdam Declaration, which called for the unconditional surrender of his country. I listened myself to the emperor's speech on the radio, and I invited our Japanese servants to come into the sitting room to hear it as well. I saw them kneel in front of the wireless set and give several deep and reverential bows whilst listening to His Majesty's words. Their faces, 269, were expressionless. Even at close quarters, it was difficult to have any idea of what must be going on in their minds and hearts, but I thought I discerned an inexpressible sadness and a feeling of amazement. Yes, it was the armistice, but nothing was certain. Many Europeans, whom I met, who had known the East for a long time, shook their heads and only rejoiced half-heartedly at the news. It would take some time, a few days, possibly a few weeks, before the Americans arrived, and nobody could be really sure of what would happen in the interim. The Japanese, I was told, had an unexpected side to their character, and it was best to be prepared for anything. There might be an epidemic of harakiri or total submission, just as there might be a real revolution. All this was not exactly reassuring. I then thought of the Allied prisoners, cut off and stranded in camps in metropolitan Japan. I hastily called all my fellow delegates together and asked them if they would be prepared to go singly into the main camps to ensure the prisoners' safety and arrange for their release. Everyone agreed without hesitation. However, there were 7 main camps, and there were only 4 of us. We then appealed to 2 calm patriots and a stateless doctor, who made up the required number. I briefly explained the seriousness of the situation to them. There was a risk involved, but it was our duty to take it. We hoped that the emperor's orders would be obeyed, but if they were not, all white people in Japan might find themselves in great danger. I next got in touch with the representatives of the protective powers, Switzerland and Sweden, who agreed to join us. In this way, we were able to make up 7 teams of 3 men. I then approached the Japa, Nice government, Foreign Affairs, and War Ministry to obtain the exact numbers of prisoners of war and civilian internees, and to find out where the camps were, as well as to secure all facilities and protection for our delegates on their mission. As soon as the Japanese authorities had given their approval, without any major problems, all the delegates left for their destination on August 27th, and we were able to report to General MacArthur by Japanese radio that we were standing by with a plan for evacuating the prisoners of war. Before our delegates left, I instructed one of them, who was to inspect the camps in the Hiroshima prefecture, to go into the city itself and to inform me as quickly and precisely as possible of the extent of the disaster and the conditions he found there. At the same time, I asked the Japanese government to provide me with any documentation they had on the situation in Hiroshima and on the known effects of the atom bomb. Reports were duly handed, 270 to me, and on September 2nd, I received the following telegram from our delegate in Hiroshima. Visited Hiroshima 30th. Situation horrifying. 80% of town razed. All hospitals destroyed or severely damaged. Have visited 2 provisional hospitals. Conditions indescribable. Full's top. Bomb effects. Surprisingly severe. Many victims. Apparently recovering. Suddenly expiry. In fatal relapse owing to degeneration of white corpuscles and other internal injuries. Deaths occurring now in great numbers. More than 100,000 injured still in provisional hospitals in neighborhood. Grave. Shortage material, bandages, medicaments. Stop. Appeal Allied High. Command asking supplies be parachuted immediately into center town. Urgently need large supplies, bandages, cotton wool, ointment for burns, sulfamides, blood plasma, and transfusion kits. Stop. Immediate action. Necessary. Also send Medical Investigation Commission. Report follows. Please acknowledge. Now that I had this documentary evidence, I got in touch on 3 September with the Supreme Command of the Allied Forces and requested in the name of the ICRC, immediate aid in food and medical supplies, for the Hiroshima victims. I offered to go there myself to organize relief operations, as I was the only doctor among the ICRC delegation in Japan. Some days later, the Supreme Allied Command responded generously to my request and informed me, through one of its high-ranking officers, that would provide the ICRC delegation with 12 tons of medicines and medical equipment for the proposed relief operation, and that the material will be transported in 6 aircraft. A special commission made up of about 10 American experts, physicists, doctors, and a photographer, as well as 2 Japanese doctors, would also be on board. I was to accompany the commission and be responsible for the district, battalion, and supervision of the relief, which was given into the charge of our delegation in Japan. On September 8, 1945, we left for the airfield at Atsugi, where I boarded one of the aircraft together with several Americans. The flight was very pleasant. We soon left Mount Fuji behind us to starboard and arrived over the large cities of Osaka and Kobe. For 12 miles there was nothing but devastation. The sites where the cities had stood were an expanse of rusty iron. Everything seemed to have been devoured by the fire. Here and there, however, there were flimsy buildings still intact, making gray and black patches against the brick red. 271 myself peered anxiously through the windows and witnessed a sight totally unlike anything we had ever seen before. The center of the city was a sort of white patch, flattened and smooth like the palm of a hand. Nothing remained. The slightest trace of houses seemed to have disappeared. The white patch was about 2 kilometers in diameter. Around its edge was a red belt, marking the area where houses had burned, extending quite a long way further, difficult to judge from the airplane, covering almost all the rest of the city. It was an awesome sight. After having flown over the city several times, our plane landed with all the others at Iwakuni Airfield, about 20 miles from Hiroshima. We unloaded the medical supplies. Several Japanese officers came to greet us and showed us to a bus which was to take us to the Japanese military headquarters of Hiroshima. Moved after the city was bombed to a small hill 15 kilometers to the south. Contacts with the Japanese authorities. The bus started and limped along as best it could. The heat was tropical. The road, which had not been repaired for years, was in a pitiful state, and we were constantly thrown out of our seats. The engine groaned, and we were not at all surprised when we finally broke down in the middle of a village. We got out of the bus. People standing around on the street crowded together and stared at the American officers, whom they were seeing for the first time. It was a strange feeling. There we were, about a dozen men, all Americans apart from myself, and unarmed. The Allied troops had not yet occupied the country, and we knew that we were entirely at the mercy of these Japanese. With the mere order given by General MacArthur to guarantee the safeguard of the Technical Commission and to provide it with all assist and needed to carry out its task be enough to protect us, I visualized one of our towns just subjected to a nuclear attack and tried to imagine the reception that the survivors would have given to a technical investigation commission sent by the enemy after imposing unconditional surrender. I feared the worst, but there was no incident. On the contrary, the village children came up to us, and the Americans handed out several packets of candy and chocolate. In the background, the Japanese parents smiled faintly, sign of embarrassment, and the atmosphere seemed to be relaxed. However, the repairs took time, and everyone was in a hurry to see the city. A military truck came along the road, and I suggested to the American general that we should requisition it to continue our journey to the Hiroshima military headquarters. One of our Japanese acted as interpreter, and after a brief discussion, we all climbed into the truck. After that, we soon arrived at the headquarters of the Japanese army, in the prefecture of Hiroshima, located on a small hill. There were several wooden army huts inside an enclosure, guarded by sentries armed with rifles. The duty officer yelled, "Present arms," as we went by. The sentry saluted, and we were taken to a Japanese colonel and several officers. Introductions were made. Everyone behaved impeccably and shook hands. Well-trained orderlies brought tea, biscuits, and cigarettes. Maps were unfolded and explanations given as to the work to come mission intended carrying out in the area. During this time, several Americans and Japanese took group photographs. Never at any time was there a feeling of hostility weighing on the party. Everything was conducted with perfect manners. This attitude on the part of the Japanese remained complete mystery to us. The Japanese people have a secret, unfathomable mentality. But deep down, these officers were obeying their emperor's orders. They bowed to the American officers, not because they were the Van-Kaish, but because they had ceased fighting and reverted to their natural politeness. After having made plans to visit Hiroshima the next day, we were taken to the famous island of Miyajima, where the commission was to stay for a few days. This island is a sanctuary. We could see in the distance the famous 100-year-old portico, showing that an ancient temple stands there. We landed at sunset in a small village of fishermen and holiday makers. This island owes its fame to the pilgrimage that Japanese warriors used to make there before leaving for the front. They would ask the Buddhist monks to hand them the written reply to their wishes. If the reply was favorable, they kept the paper and the charm that went with it pressed tightly to their chest. If the prediction was unfavorable, they pinned it to one of the sacred trees surrounding the temple, hoping that they might thereby win the favor of a reluctant deity. All the Americans with me were delighted to experience their first evening of Japanese life. We were put up in small hotels in the pine woods. The floor of each bedroom was covered with a tatami, a mat of plaited straw, very soft and pleasant to walk on. Shoes had to be removed before entering. We were all handed kimonos to go and take a communal bath in a large pool. Several Americans made the classic mistake of the uninformed and threw themselves, covered with soap, into water. 273 to the horror of the Japanese staff. Indeed, the custom in Japan, and it is a lesson to us all, is to wash thoroughly with soap and then rinse it off before diving into the almost boiling water of the bath. During the evening, as we were talking together, I became friendly with Professor Tsuki, professor of surgery at the Imperial University of Tokyo. He told me the following story himself. In 1923, Professor Tsuki, then a young doctor at the Imperial University of Tokyo, was particularly interested in the function of Coolidge tubes, which the Japanese had just bought from the United States to treat cancer. Suddenly he had a strange idea. He took a rabbit from the laboratory and at 9 o'clock in the evening, taking advantage of the staff's absence, he exposed his rabbit completely to the X-ray lamp in order to observe the massive effect of these new rays on living organisms. At 9.50, then 10 o'clock, the rabbit showed no signs of discomfort whatsoever. At 11 o'clock, the rabbit was still behaving normally and seemed perfectly alert. A doubt began to enter the young doctor's mind. At midnight, the rabbit gave no visible sign of any reaction. Dr. Tsuki switched off the apparatus, picked up the rabbit, put it on the carpet of his office, and lit a cigarette. He was just musing on this strange experiment, seemingly without results, when suddenly the rabbit went into convulsions and died at his feet. The young doctor could think of no explanation for this mysterious death. Tired and half asleep, he put the rabbit in the icebox to examine it later. The next morning, he told the story to his professor, who reprimanded him soundly, reproaching him for the futility of this experiment. He even pointed out that, in some countries, he would have been prosecuted for experimenting on live animals without good reason. However, this did not deter the Japanese doctor. Several days later, he began the autopsy on his rabbit and to his amazement observed hemorrhages and suffusions of blood throughout all the organs, the kidneys, lungs, heart, etc. His scientific curiosity was then stimulated even more. He repeated his experiments. In May 1926, his findings were disclosed at the 27 Annual Congress of the American Radiological Society in Detroit. They were published in the American Journal of Röntgenology, Radium Therapy and Nuclear Medicine in New York, and entitled Experimental Studies on the Biological Action of Hard Röntgen Rays. When his work was presented, it caused discussion. Today it is interesting to reread the thoughts expressed at the time by Dr. G. E. Fowler from Philadelphia. Here below is an account of what he said. It is naturally almost impossible for us to grasp in a few minutes the 274 significance of the facts revealed in all these experiments. However, as far as I can see, two ideas emerge from these facts. First of all, these experiments are based on the exposure of a whole animal to X-rays, and consequently, the observations made by Dr. Gisuke concerning effects on the various organs cannot be directly translated into clinical values, as we could apply them in routine clinical work, because we never expose the whole body of an individual. We limit exposure to a part of the body, to an organ or to part of an organ. Secondly, by limiting exposure to part of an organ, the relative effects are obviously less. Otherwise, we would soon stop using radiotherapy, judging by the effects observed on the various organs. 25 years later, Dr. Masao Tsuzuki, who had since become professor at the Imperial University of Tokyo, was the man appointed by the Japanese government and later by the American authorities to study the effect of X-rays, not on the body of a rabbit, but on thousands of human beings, his own compatriots. His findings were almost identical to the observations he had made long before on the rabbit exposed to the rays of the Coolidge tube.